Hey, this is Resilience Radio. I'm Irvin Eisenberg, host of the show and owner of Resilience Occupational Therapy. As always, the opinions on this show are not necessarily shared by me or Resilience Occupational Therapy. Every person has their own individual healthcare needs, and not everything is going to resonate with everyone. Additionally, none of this is meant to be medically prescriptive or diagnostic in any way. Today's episode is one of a short series of episodes that I'll be doing with my interviewing of Gil Hedley, who is a really amazing dissection artist, for lack of a better word. He's a scientist he's really done a lot of work with cadavers. So if discussion of cadavers and dead bodies is something that upsets you, maybe this isn't appropriate for you. But in any case, he is a rolfer and has done a lot of dissections, including the dissections that became the anatomy trains for some of my structural integration training. In this episode, we discuss both Gil Hedley's respect for the body, as well as just how much variety there is within the human form, and what its implications are. Let's start off with discussing around sort of your relationship with dissection, and I've always been impressed by how detail-oriented you can be, while at the same time being both having a sense of humor and having such a deep respect for the bodies you're working with. I'd be curious to hear about your relationship with the bodies and sort of what you're thinking about when you...
Yeah, it's pretty personal. I take it personally. I'm very conscious and conscientious of the fact that I'm working with a gift from a family whose loved one passed away, and that a gift is meant to be open. So I'm not shy about opening a present that's given to me, and I do it with enthusiasm and joy. It seems fitting. So I'm not a doleful. My reverence is real, but my irreverence is real too. And my irreverence is never at the expense of my donor gifts. Usually it's at my expense as they confound me and confuse me and lead me down paths of discovery. So I am having a good time when I'm doing my work. And I'm also I'm sort of fanatically obsessed with the learning process. And, I literally can say without hesitation that there's never been a donor form cadaver that I've worked on that I didn't learn something from, for the first time. I'm constantly learning. It's like, it's the whole universe there. You can't really comprehend it. So if you can stay humble and with a beginner's mind, you'll be continually either disrupted in the beliefs that you bring to the table, or you just simply be led down things you hadn't even thought of yet. So it's a rich world, the human body. I count it as a universe. And I always joke that, if you ask Carl Sagan late in his career, just pointed up at the sky and said, "What's that star?" He'd be like, "I don't know." Like, in other words, it's a big sky, folks. I haven't finished learning about it yet. So that's kind of how I approach it, and it is also very personal. I'm trying to become embodied, right? In other words, that's the effort. I have a very intellectual start to my existence, and for me, this has been the path of encounter with these donor forms has been very much about me coming into connection with my own form, my own body, trying to live in here consciously. And I do find that, anatomy kind of comes alive when you've actually witnessed some structure, and then you can incorporate that, feel it in your own body.
So you talk about each body sort of being its own universe, and how much you're always discovering something with each new dissection.
Yeah.
How much of that discovery and surprise is just because there's so much in every body, and how much is because there's so much differences between bodies?
Yes and yes, right? That's a great question, because it really does touch on two important points. One is the bottomlessness of this discovery path, and the other one is the absolute uniqueness of our forms, we really do it our way. Frank Sinatra was talking about integral anatomy, it turns out, because we we uh, we we are each to an individual an ultimately perfect, unique, 100% legitimate version of the human body. And I I like to say that the mirror we should be looking into shouldn't be that of the generics of the books, but the uniqueness of one another. So I can see your uniqueness, and in your uniqueness, I find my own uniqueness reflected. And in that, we become brothers, right?
Mhm.
Uh, Brothers, sisters, or anything under the sun, because whether we're looking at a farm animal or a pet or another human being, we can see reflected there in the differences, the uniqueness, so that the differences then become a complement, right? Rather than a point for separation. And that, as a philosophical starting point, is key for me. That the differences that are our variable expression of humanness represent, rather than something that I should judge myself by or judge you by, right? Those differences, instead of being cause for separation, become cause for identification, and camaraderie, in our differences, rather than um, pushing off of one another based on that.
Could you give some examples of a variety of structures that listeners might be surprised with?
Oh my gosh, everything. In other words, I in my A to Z project that's up on my website for Explorer folk, I literally compare, every named muscle in the body of these two donors, Anna and Z. And you can't go from one peck to the other without finding differences. And then you can't go from two pecks of one person to two pecks of another person and not find differences. If you're paying attention, and that's kind of what I like to do. You mentioned that early on. I appreciated that you noticed I like to pay attention to things. I give some attention to the details, because it's in the details that we find the uniqueness, right? Because you can say, oh, look, all those people, or 99% of them, have a leg on either side and an arm on either side. We're all the same. It's like, well, look a little closer at that arm or that leg, or that liver or that spleen, right? Because as different as our faces are, one from another, so equally different and equally imprinted by my uniqueness is my femur, or my stomach has its own shape, and there'll be some generic stomach in the book. So this is general plot line to a stomach. There's sort of a skinny bit at the top, and it kind of bubbles out, gets big, and kind of gets skinnier, and then there's a exit path, right? But unless the stomach just looks like a rope on a given person, which sometimes it does, or in which case that fundus can hold like 2 gallons of fluid, and you're like, damn, there was an eater there, or what have you, because our organ system is responding to our place in the world and the way that we live in it. So you can't not be unique. I mean, it's like, every single computer, for instance, has its own, how many apps is on it, how many, what's the operating software, when was it made, what components does it have, all these different elements. So to make it such that each computer is literally an individual, right? And similarly, where do you live? How long have you lived there? Where else have you lived? What's in the soil in that place? How does that affect, your chemistry? When does the sun come up and set in your part of the world? How does it affect you and the way that you are in the world? So the place we are in the world, what we put in our mouths, where we are in the world, the community in which we're embedded will change the way that we move through space due to the values that are inherent in that community. And that will change your shape. So there's so many, the operating systems, as to make the extended computer analogy, that identify us uniquely, because you're the only one, honestly, who's eaten those foods in those places in those times in the context of that community, that family, blah, 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 that it boils down. You can't generalize so readily, as we tend to. If you want to be interested in the details, if you don't care, you say, "Oh yeah, humans are just the hairless apes. What else you got?"
So I've heard you talk a little bit about the difference between balance and symmetry, and I was thinking about the difference between one peck and the other peck, like you were describing. And
Yeah.
could you speak to everyone's different? That doesn't mean, and everyone's unique, and that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is equally healthy or equally for
Oh,
themselves.
not at
Um,
all. We're uniquely diseased.
but can you speak about
We're
balance?
uniquely traumatized as well as uniquely expressing the joys and beauty of our communities and context. But yeah, I mean, symmetry and balance that's a favorite topic of mine, just because it's well, if you look in the mirror after your 10th session of a of a series, right? And you're hoping your client looks kind of, you know, symmetrical. I mean, we carry that prejudice with us, right? From our trainings, like as if, but what is the symmetry of the human body? Because certainly it doesn't mean a Euclidean identification of one side to another of an equilateral triangle that's been bisected, from its apex to its base, right? That makes mirror images from one side to another. If that's what you mean by symmetry, or that's what you're looking for it, you're just confoundedly wrong when you enter into the realm of biological systems, which aren't symmetrical in that way, right? We have a fractal, geometry, not a Euclidean geometry. So we're not going to find mirror symmetries in our bodies, but we will find our balance around a center line if we want to move through space. If we want to be bipedal and stand up and make it across the room, there's going to have to be some kind of balance that's in our bodies. And so in order to generate that balance, we're going to have to overcome and compensate and account for that time you screwed up your knee or ankle, or that time you picked up something that was too heavy and your discs kind of went wonky. And so we find our balance not through a mirror symmetry, but through compensations around a very rough symmetry. So what symmetry we have is like, eyeball on either side of your nose, ear on either side of your head, a couple of hemispheres in your brain. We have some, but you only got, one heart center, one liver, one spleen, one stomach. We have this whole visceral apparatus, which is very much impacting our musculoskeletal form, whether we know it or not. And we're walking around the central axis of asymmetry. And consequently, how balanced can we be when we do that? And I found that was kind of my work when I was doing structural integration. Like, how can you how can you help a person have mirror symmetry in a mirror when they stand? But they're just going to do it, right? You're going to be like, okay, my shoulder's not right. I'm going to make it. I'm going to make my hands this way. And you can just it's a fake. You're going to fake mirror symmetry through muscular compensation in the moment to please your practitioner without ever achieving it, because it's not only not achievable, but not even a worthwhile goal, in my opinion.
What is your goal when you were working as a structural integrator? If not looking from sort of left to right, how do we balance those two shoulders?
Well, I got to say, I didn't last too long. I didn't last over long in the field, because maybe my goal was more about, I consider myself a tour guide. So that was the metaphor I used for my practice, that I was going to be a tour guide, and I was going to take a person on a very thorough and meaningful tour of their body. By touching them all over the place, would help them to establish a conscious connection with their body. And if they could register themselves in space as a physical being in a more thoroughgoing way than they might have before their first session with me, then those conscious connections that were established through touch and movement in the course of my work with them would hopefully result in the body and the person adjusting themselves in a way that was favorable, to their life experience and movement patterns.
I tend to like to think of that as sort of helping the brain take inventory of what's there.
Exactly. That's it.
It's like, and the magic is in the person balancing around that and going, oh yeah, I forgot that part of my knee could be in my awareness while I stepped forward. And whether it's conscious awareness or not is actually probably conscious is less important.
Exactly. Because your brain can be taking care of things that you're not conscious of and doing it well. In fact, we're usually pretty clumsy initially when we, become conscious of movement. It's like blinker, you're driving the car for the first time and you have to think blinker, but after a while it doesn't even register. You just do things. So
could you speak to your journey as far as the body work you did and the dissections you do, sort of which came first and what led to what?
Yeah. So I guess that's an interest. My interest, I started kind of as a bodybuilder as a kid. I grew up in the 70s. I'm the child of the 60s and the 70s, a very small child in the 60s. I was born in 63. So I was a teenager in the 70s, the age of the bodybuilding craze. And that was my sport. And then, I moved on to Tai Chi in grad school. And, I was doing dissection in high school. I did a rat and a cat, and I thought that was really fun. I did some more cats, and in grad school, I worked in a biology lab. In undergrad, I worked in a biology lab. So I don't know, it all kind of overlapped because when I was in grad school studying theology and ethics, I also started looking into body work as a path of embodiment for me. I was doing Tai Chi massage and this kind of thing in my Tai Chi classes, and people were lining up for me to work on them. So I was like, oh, something's going on here. That's interesting. And so I wanted to support my study as a Rolfing practitioner and as a massage therapist with a deeper dive into the body. So I started doing the dissection. It was pretty much simultaneous, really. Okay. And then that just took over because I was like, oh, this is cool. And then it turned out for me, my healing work was less of a one-on-one thing in a practitioner client relationship than it was group work. So if I'm going to say that I continued my work as a healer or as a Rolfer, I like to Rolf a group rather than an individual. And I do that by we all pay attention to the bodies on the table. And in that exploration, just like a Rolfing series where you're encountering your whole body over the course of the series, in the course of a dissection process, you're encountering the whole body, bringing it into consciousness, creating an intentional relationship with the stuff under the hood, as it were, right? And then in doing so, it's rather than touching a person's body to bring them into a relationship with that whole world, I can lead a whole group of people who are touching body, right, to enter into a relationship with that connection with themselves intentionally. So I just sort of scaled it.
We have various ideas of what our body tissues are like. I have a client right now who keeps referring to, that rebar in my hip flexors. And I'm like, oh, let's not call it rebar or that ropey muscle, or isn't this muscle like a rock? And people have these these solid images of immovable objects that I'm going to magically melt away for them. Um, for people's
That's a tall order there, fella.
so for people who are walking around thinking about those ropes in their low back or the rebar in their hip flexors, how would you encourage them to shift their perspective in their own embodiment?
Those things literally are a perspective. They're representative of a way of being in the world. And so it is very humbling, to get work because you realize you're the one who's doing it. This is not the body punishing you for being, on earth. It's more like we're constantly so deaf to the cries of Whoville within us. Like, we're here, we're here, we're here. And you're just like, I don't hear you. Shout it louder. Like, well, I'm here, I'm here. And now your body turns into ropes, because long before that rope formed, there were whispers from Whoville saying, hey, you might want to do this thing a little differently. Would you consider doing this thing a little differently? And we're like, no, I'm just going to keep doing it this way until you shout at me. And then you get shouted at. And now you're like, oh, I hear that. But instead of taking it in as wisdom of the body speaking to you and asking you to do things a little differently, you consider it to be a betrayal of the body, who is now a perpetrator, and you're just a victim of it. And you're going to go to some savior practitioner who's going to help you out, make it all go away. So if you want to get a different frame of mind, it has to be one of connection and joyful agency for the body, right? That it's nature representing in the world your way of being in it. So number one is to find agency and responsibility in your felt experience of your body, so that I don't place it all on a practitioner to fix it for me, right? But rather maybe the practitioner can help me connect with what my agency has accomplished so far in my body, which is ropes and rocks and rebar, and help teach me or help me to learn or understand other ways of being in the world that generate a different signature in nature, because all those experiences are nature's signatures that are drawing out your way of being in a world.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one. Another thing is the body is a big jellyfish. It's a big, wet, sloppy, gelatinous jellyfish, and that with some bones inside of it, and that somehow and it's changeable in an instant to express any desire or will or intention. And so to experience and restore that ability, that dynamism, that dynamic fluidity of the body, maybe could be an object or an intention, so that the whole membrane system of the body can facilitate differential movement in the way that it was originally organized, so that we really can express many things, because we very much program our tissues to be mobile in some places and immobile in others, right? And those combinations of mobilities and immobilities that are initially expressed through on and off flashes of musculature, but ultimately become expressed in gumminess and stuckness in our membrane system, in our fascial system, become signatures of our personality, right? So that our stuck places aren't accidents necessarily of our bodies, but our, in other words, I was raised very Catholic, Roman Catholic, and, every Sunday and ultimately every day, I used to go to mass every day for 10 years. I went to mass every day. And you're literally, it's like some people go to the gym, some people go to mass, So I went to mass, and the movement pattern that became representative of my way of being in the world was very small, limited, as a result of kneeling in prayer, standing in prayer, managing my emotions and sexuality in a way that created incredible limit cycles on the way that I move through space, right? I froze up certain areas of my body in order to be that way, to express myself in that way. And when I went to the Prof Institute as a grad student, as a super Catholic grad student studying theology and ethics, my movement repertoire had only just begun to open up with my Tai Chi practice. So Tai Chi expanded my movement repertoire, but the Rolfing process expanded my movement repertoire even more, right? And many people go and either through their learning to become a Rolfer or just through their experience as a client, they are expanded in their movement repertoire. It's a beautiful thing, so long as the social and familial and cultural context can hold it, right? Because if you start swagging your hips through your house, and moving outside of the framework of your social and religious and familial context, you might not fit anymore. People end up getting divorced and leaving their church or etc. Why? Because they're climbing out of the box and they don't fit anymore. So there's risk in letting go of those ropes and those rebars and those rocks. And the risk is that you'll become a different person.
You might not fit in the box that you're in.
Exactly. And so when your client comes back exactly the same as they were before you got this great change out of them a week or two prior, and they've gone back to square one, well, it could be because their social context isn't ready. You're not just Rolfing a person, you're Rolfing their whole world. And depending upon a person's willingness to alter that world or become a different person, your change may or may not hold. And that goes for any kind of body work, really, or any kind of movement work, or Pilates or yoga or what have you. Things that bring people into a different relationship with their body impose upon their world either a demand for acceptance of the change, or a change of circumstance.
So to sort of bring this to called Resilience Radio, and when I first contacted you, you were like, well, I don't know if I could speak to resilience specifically. I could speak about a lot of things.
Did I just do it?
I feel like you at least spoke adjacent to it. You were talking about change, but I'm curious what you would say to both the bodies, and I tend to define resilience in sort of two different ways. One is sort of your ability to take the challenges that life throws at you, and other times to take the literal forces to your body. And I guess as someone who's observed a lot of different bodies and a lot of different stories that people have gone through, do you have any thoughts on resiliency?
Well, if you put it that way, I'd say that our resilience increases when our capacity for differential movement increases, right? So that to me, it all boils down to differential movement, right? Here's whether it's one large muscle fasciculi next to another, or one muscle fiber, like I'm talking fiber down at the microscopic level next to another, or one massive muscle tissue relative to a fascia with regard to which it has differential movement. So here's differential movement. It could be this ain't going anywhere, and this is going somewhere. Or maybe they're both going in different directions or rolling relative to each other. There's differential movement. And it's what makes us different from the trees, right? So the tree bark is kind of fixed to the underlying, circumferential layers of the tree. And that's it. They're not really moving relative to each other. But with us, we've got this. That is crazy. That's what makes this tree able to get up and walk around, right? The potential for differential movement. And so my resilience, my ability to, as you described, absorb forces or maybe hold a change even, my resilience is at a very mechanical level dependent upon facilitating differential movement. Because if I can't do this, nothing's going to happen. And so, and what I was saying earlier about sort of our patterns are really representations of places in our body where we have differential movement and places where we don't. So the stuff we use has differential movement. The stuff that we don't use gets kind of gummy, kind of more solid, like that rebar or rock or rope that you described earlier. All of those metaphors are metaphors for a lack of differential movement somewhere in our body, to a degree, right? And so if we want to be resilient, we're going to need to facilitate movement wherever it was born to happen in our bodies, because over time we've let go of our potential for movement in the places where it might not serve the way that we want to move through the world. Now, those are ideas, right? So at a very mechanical level, it's going to boil down in my mind to differential movement. But I'm an ethicist before I'm an anatomist. And so I want to look at a person's mind frame, right? And their set of ideas, because that's what's holding us in place generally, is our belief system about ourselves. And is that resilient? Because if you are dogmatic, as I have been earlier in my life, super dogmatic, right? Now I'm a dogma crusher. That's my goal, is to get differential movement in my belief system so that I'm not locked in to a certain way of thinking and believing, so much so that my body gives form to that set of ideas in a way that creates limit cycles on my ability to move through space. So, because that's how it works. I have an idea that sex is suspect, going to church every day is good, and my pelvis is going to be moving in a very limited way as a result of that, like frozen. My eyes were cast down on the ground, maybe 6 feet in front of me. I didn't look up at people. No, I looked down like a monk. I don't want to be, sinning with my eyes. You know what I'm saying? So I was walking around like a monk with my eyes down on the ground, my hips very still, my back was straight, right? And so that set of ideas created a movement pattern that creates a lack of differential movement in my pelvis, in my spine, and then the physical ramifications of that manifest as pain, which then register to my religious mind as salvific. Well, I'm suffering, that must be good, so right. And so it spirals into itself, and you think you're just tinkering with someone's fascia. You're not tinkering with someone's fascia, you're tinkering with their belief system, right? When you touch them. And then the question is is their belief system resilient or is it brittle? Is it fragile? Because if it's a fragile belief system, they're going to run out of your office if you start tinkering with it, right? But if there's resilience in the belief system, if the ultimate concern is actually ultimate rather than some finite thing, then you can tinker with it, and a person will be able to take in that change.
I think you start off by sort of describing almost how infinite the body is in its complexities and ways you can view it and work on it. And then, and that's just one body, and then the infinite variabilities between bodies. Can you leave us with a couple of surprising factoids that you've discovered over the years about in the process of your dissections? Either a one-off, like I saw this once, or hey, all people have this interesting relationship.
Oh my gosh. There is some weird stuff in the human body that I've seen. One was like an encapsulated tumor that wasn't attached to anything. It was just floating around someone's gut. It was just like a friggin' baseball floating on by, not attached to anything, just almost a baseball-sized tumor with just floating.
And it wasn't causing any issues. It was just sort of in its own orbit.
Just cruising by. And that might be the thing, is that you can have all sorts of weirdness in your body and you're just fine. And that's a testament to our resilience. We are, in some sense, a fragile creature. If you take away our oxygen for a little while, we're goners, right? But we can be like hit by a train, fall from a plane. We can endure the worst diets for decades. And we just still keep on going. I think that's one of the things that I find remarkable when I'm in the lab. It's like, wow, this person kept on going. I mean, I've uncovered 20 massive things that were off the charts wrong with them, and they're 90. Like, it's amazingly resilient. We are, despite our fragility. And so, because of that, I think we're always capable of making a shift, always capable of making a change if we want to. Why not? Just for the fun of it.
Well, that's a great note to go out on there. Okay, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and all the work and contribution you've given to, I would say, a particular field, but the field of being human and our awareness. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Irvin. It's a pleasure to chat with you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Resilience Radio. I know I really enjoyed this conversation with Gil. If you did, you can stay tuned for more videos or check some of the other ones in our series with different structural integrators on fascia or any of the other healthcare video interviews we have. Subscribing so you can get a new episode in your stream every week. The music was brought to you by Aaron Marcus with their tune Some Biological Process. You can check the show notes for full credits on that. Again, I hope you enjoyed listening. Take care.